broader statistical sampling to look a little further, but with a low risk, you can limit that amount of statistical sampling.
It takes a while to get off that high risk list.
About 3 years.
It does, and you're there, but we still have high risk programs. You as an auditee may not be high risk, but there are high risk programs. So our sampling size actually is still about the same because those programs are high risk. So and actually since we started our audit however many years ago with you, our sampling numbers have actually increased and we're still not finding issues. So we've actually increased the number of samples and things that we look at since we started 8-9 years ago, whatever it was, and still aren't finding issues.
Great. Well, thank you for all that.
Yeah.
On the FASB and GASB and all those accounting standards, the capitalization of operating leases is already through the books. That's all done.
That was done in 22, and then the spit of the new one this year had to do with it's kind of like leases, intangibles, things of that nature that we have. It's the same accounting. We pulled those liabilities onto the books as well. Hopefully that's it for now. The next huge project that is coming is GASB is completely rewriting how this is done. And I was really hoping I would be retired before they did it. I really was. I don't think I'm going to make it. So I don't know how many years out that is, but they're redoing the entire presentation of this document.
But they claim it's going to make it simpler.
That's what they claim.
What they're saying.
So that's a few years away.
Is it more than 4?
Honestly, I'm not sure. Hang on. Do you know where your note is? I know where most people's, but
It's in the beginning, but I don't know.
Debbie, do you know off the top of your head?
What?
Debbie's hoping she's retired before they rewrite this.
Yes, I am building my retirement on that.
I don't blame you.
I bet a lot of people are.
I think I will be too.
Everybody puts it in a different place. I know where it is in the ones that we draft.
Right.
I know where that footnote is that talks about. Yeah. Anyway, I'll find it. I'll give you an answer, but I'll get back to you. But anyway, it may be in here, but it's.
Last one, GASB, FASB, has there been any talk at all about capitalizing economic incentives if you forgive $5 million of tax revenue or defer? Is there any thought about putting that on the books at all?
I'm not
So you
aware
have
of
a limited amount of.
Don't, yeah, don't float anything to the public world that can be
After your
sent to them.
retirement. After your retirement.
10 years out, please.
Any other questions or thoughts for the PD mayors? Other than just thank you for all the good work you do, and really appreciate your coming. And you'll be presenting to the board at our board meeting.
Yes, sir.
And just to confirm, we do not need to make a motion to adopt this annual consolidated report. This is a presentation only, information only. This is administrative action where you file this with the state, so there's no action required by this committee or the board.
We do have to submit to the state a letter stating that Mike presented this formally to the board, but we've already got that signed and ready to roll.
Administrative action.
If you rejected the audit, I don't know what would happen, but that wouldn't be good, so.
But so this committee does not need to make any kind of motion on this. This is really information only, and it'll be presented again to the broader board. And there again, the broader board won't need to take any action necessarily. It's information only. And you have several copies that you're not going to need to carry back to your car.
I do. There's a copy here for everyone.
Thank you so much.
And anyone else who may want.
There you go.
And Mr. Chair, to expound upon the point you made earlier, in the past, we had to have called meetings for this in order to get it into the state by the state's deadline. The state has changed their deadline now, so this is now within the context of the confines of when we're supposed to be doing it. So we do not have to have a called meeting anymore to accept our audit in order to get it to the state in time.
Great. Thank you. And thank you to them for doing that, because a special meeting around Thanksgiving was not a lot of fun. So December 15th will be in on time. No asterisks.
Yes, sir.
There you go. Super. All right. Well, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Trevor.
Thanks.
Give me just a minute or two to see you in a little bit. For those that have not been around that long, we've had 3 different audit firms during my tenure on the board, and it's typical practice to rotate every so often. Last go around, I believe we audited or rotated the primary individual on our account. So we got a different partner, different set of eyes, as opposed to a different firm. But I think we've been doing this firm now 5 years.
5 years.
So it may or may not be time at some point in the reasonably near future to at least go through that process.
We will be putting it out for bid January-ish, January, February.
Do you want to steal your
I
thunder
would
there?
love to keep PB Mares, but yeah, we've got to put it out for bid and see what we get back.
And again, we could end up in the same place or a different place, but it's a healthy process to go through to get a new set of eyes. So it's been 3 different firms looking at our books over the years. And so we're getting clean audit is fantastic news. It's as good as it gets. But our books have been looked at by other firms as well. So this is just a confirmation that we're on the right track. Okay? All right, next item on the agenda is the fiscal year 2024 first quarter projections. This is, again, is information only, and Carly, going to walk us through?
Sure.
Thank you.
All right, while we are early in December, almost halfway through the year, these are just the first quarter projections. So these are numbers that were the predictions as of September 30th. I am predicting that we bring in slightly higher amount of real estate taxes as well as interest. The real estate tax estimate is based on information recently received from our assessor's office. It looks like the second half of the billing that we'll collect before June 30 is significantly higher than what we had budgeted on. We also kept our interest rate obviously higher than the prior year, but it was still on the conservative side compared to what we're seeing now. So I think we're going to bring in about $700,000 higher than what we thought. And I'm hoping that my estimate is correct on expenses, a little over $1 million to be returned by departments. And that's really just based on current year vacancies that we know of, which make up the bulk of the budget. And is, just looking at prior years' trends of unused funds. To have an operating surplus of $10.7 million, however, out of that, we transfer money out to the CIP fund, and we've already chosen to fund a $500,000 tanker with fund balance. And tonight we'll be bringing, which I knew when I was putting this together, that we'd be bringing a few other requests forward to be funded through fund balance. So all in all, I'm looking at a almost flatline budget, right where we were predicting a net change in fund balance of $200,000. But taxes have not yet come in. We'll have a much better idea looking at the end of December. So that's where we are now.
Well, where does the annual assessment stand in this one, the assessor's office?
Number-wise,
They've started their work, but they given us any?
they have
feedback?
preliminary numbers for us. So
Right.
that's what my second half collections is based on.
And they're coming
They're-
in about 7.9%, I think it was,
I believe so, yeah.
ahead of last year.
Ahead of
So
last year.
it's still a strong and positive. It is lower than last year or the year before, which we anticipated and expected that it would be slowing down, but at this point, it doesn't show any sign of a bottom falling out. It's just a more gradual decrease, but it's still a very healthy increase.
Well, okay. I know they've been predicting a recession for a couple of years now, and predicting the bottom to fall in the real estate market, but that's
Right.
not the case.
Not a
So
good
far.
one.
Not so
Not
far.
in Goochland. All right, we'll take it. Okay, anything else on the financials? It looks like all of our targets are being met.
Yes.
And we'll talk about the targets later on when we talk about the policies and whatnot. The fund balance that we have now is earning pretty darn close to 5%, is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
So just information only here, if we spend $1 million out of fund balance, that would reduce our budget going forward by about $50,000 a year, every year. So for every $1 million we spend, it reduces our budget going forward. So just something to keep in mind. Let's see, because that interest is in the budget. It's not off budget, so. Okay, again, we're in line with all the numbers, and the lights are on, and the heating and air conditioning works, so I guess we're paying our bills, so. Any questions or thoughts? Yes, sir.
Excuse me, one quick clarification. So when you say we save that money, that's not in our budget, is that from the decrease in revenues from the interest?
Yeah, the revenues from the interest are in our budget,
Right.
so any reduction in that line item would reduce our revenues available to spend.
Exactly. I just want to
So
clarify.
there'd have to be
Reduce the cash
corresponding
in the bank.
expense decreases to offset that. You know, reserves, it's reasonably easy to maintain your reserves because all you have to do is spend everything that comes in. It's much harder to build the reserves because you have to take in money and then not spend it. We've done the heavy lifting and managed to build the reserves to the point where we did get the AAA credit rating. And to maintain it going forward, we will have to add the reserves to the extent our budget grows. So if the budget grows by 8%, we need to increase the reserves by 8% to keep that same relative safety net for the county. So there will be some pressure to continue to build, but the hard work of getting to where we are today has been done already. The easy part, again, is just don't spend any more than comes in and you're in good shape. Now, the capital spending programs that we've done each year, we managed to spend that out of operating surplus every year. So it's averaged around 6, 7 million, 8 million a year. That's about where our surplus has been, so it's covered the annual, because we do want to maintain our capital assets. That's something that's critical. So if you have an operating surplus sufficient to cover your maintenance capital, then your expansion capital is something you might issue bonds for or borrow money, but your annual maintenance is covered by that. Then you can continue to maintain your reserves going forward, continue to generate that interest going forward, and keep maintaining your budget going forward. Does that make any sense?
Makes total sense to me. You would hope.
All right, I'll take that chuckle as an affirmation that we're doing the right thing. Let's see. Well, thank you for that presentation, Carl. I appreciate that. Let's see. And we've got those reserves despite passing the largest tax cut in the county's history this past year. So
That's right.
we maintain reserves in spite of that. That's great. And again, we don't need to approve those projections. They're just a quarterly, and part of our financial policy is to circle back with the board on a quarterly basis and let the board know how we're doing. And so that checks that box. The next item on the agenda is the approval of the Goodston County financial management policies. I'll let Carla walk us through it. The policies were circulated in advance and redlined and blacklined and all of the good stuff. There are some incremental changes that we're proposing to the policy, and once we get done, I'll move to this committee to move to either recommend approval, modification, disapproval to the broader board, and then we'll ask the broader board to approve, disapprove, modify these policies as they see fit. Because these policies were adopted by the Board of Supervisors, and as such, we make recommendations, but not approve or deny. So with that as a little bit of backdrop, Carly, would you like to walk us through some of the changes?
I will, yes. So we went through these changes in pretty good detail last Audit Finance Committee meeting. So I'll review high level these changes and then point out one additional one we've made since then, which we talked about, but now it's in writing. So the first change was to the operating budget policies, and this is the additional change that was added, which is on page 4. We had added the word structurally balanced budget, and that's just emphasizing that we don't want to balance our budget with non-operating revenue. So we don't want to count on debt to balance our budget. We don't want to count on fund balance. We want to bring in annual operating revenue to balance our annual operating expenses. One change that we've made here in writing is in talking about the structurally balanced budget, we're excluding any, so it says any use of fund balance, debt issuance, or transfer to the CIP program for non-maintenance costs. And we're adding that because that's an expense that, while we love to fund it every year, and we always do, in a crisis, we could cut those out. Those are not truly operating expenses. So we just wanted to touch on that because that's a big chunk of our annual expenses out of the general fund. So that is probably our biggest change to these operating budget policies. The next change, which we discussed last meeting, was to the capital improvement policies. Yes.
Pretty moving.
Sure.
So just for educational purposes, Mr. Chair, if I heard you right, Carly, you said that being that structurally would no longer include interest or loans and things of that nature.
It will include
But
interest.
it does
won't
include interest.
include bonds.
Won't include bonds.
New
Okay.
bonds or loans that we take out.
Perfect.
Because interest we do get every year.
Okay, great. Thank
Debt
you.
we don't borrow every year, so we don't want to fund it.
It's the idea of matching recurring with recurring and one time with one time.
Okay. Fair enough.
And one of the things that brought this to the fore, quite frankly, in my experience, was that the state, the Virginia state government has a policy to pass a balanced budget every year. But it includes proceeds from debt issuance, it includes rating the rainy day fund, it includes a lot of one-time items. And that's how they got in a little bit of trouble, and the credit rating agencies put them on credit watch for possible downgrade, was because they took the rainy day fund down from $1.2 billion down to $280 million actually. And the trend was using those one-time uses to fund recurring expenses, and that's where they threw the flag. So they do not have to have a structurally balanced budget at the state level, but they just can use whatever they can get their hands on to balance it. And we don't think that's maybe necessarily the right way to do it, so this is a little different approach, which is you match your recurring with recurring and your one-time for one-time. And
One of the biggest drivers of that is going from a historically long zero interest rate environment to where we are right now, correct? I mean, the interest is actually meaningful now versus where we were for 15 years.
It can fund
for
something now.
about 10 years, when interest rates were zero, cash was trash. Well, cash is no longer trash. So
Yeah.
the reserves are actually providing a meaningful number, about $3 million a year, to our budget. And if we spend all the reserves, we lose $3 million a year going forward. So it's one of those things where it's nice to have reserves. It's actually paying us more than we're paying on our debt in some cases. But
Well, it also makes future borrowings, though, that much more significant.
yes, you probably want to time the future borrowings. We won't be as lucky as we did last time. It was $50 million. We brought it in at 1.8 and 1.9. And it may not be that lucky, but you're right. It is something to take into consideration as we consider the timing of when to go to the market. But the other remaining, I think, is 46 million of the bond referendum funds. How we doing? Okay, so that's structural balance.
They're structurally balanced. Then moving to the next policy within this is the capital improvement budget policies. This is really just putting words into our current practice. The old policy used to read, the county will develop a 5-year plan for CIP, and we just wanted to emphasize that we need to identify revenue sources for those 5 years of spending. So no real significant changes to how we are currently operating. We just want to emphasize that we need to identify the funding.
Yeah, this CIP, as you all know, we have a 25-year CIP. And part of the reason for that is we want to know what the expenses are for the remaining useful life of all the county's assets, some of which stretch out 20, 30, 40 years. And we want to know if we did a 5-year plan, for instance, if we need 2 schools in year 6, we kind of want to know that before year 5. So we have a 25-year lays out all the expenses, but we initially tried to balance 25 years worth of expenses, and that was kind of chasing yourself. So we decided to back off of that quite a bit and say, what kind of visibility do we have into the revenues? And 3, 4, 5 years out, it starts to get pretty fuzzy. So we've undertaken to at least have a general plan for the 5 years, recognizing that we only appropriate 1 year at a time. But we ought to at least have some thought about for the next 5 anyway, and then also know what's coming out for the next 25. So we know how to plan for the future without actually having to bind ourselves with finding how we're going to pay for 20 years from now. So does that make any sense? I mean, those are the changes that we're making here.
That also allows us to make sure that our CIP is a valid one, and so that if we put in a pie-in-the-sky project, this $80 million project, and we can't identify a source of revenue to pay for it, that maybe that's not a project we should be talking about. And that takes away people focusing and saying, well, we're going to build this in this many years, when we don't see any way we can build this. So it forces us not to have projects in there that we can't legitimately come up with some sense of where we're going to pay for it from.
That's a good point. That's a good point.
And additionally, we have better and better information each year because we have new indices on the market. I mean, we didn't have the VIX, 20 years ago? And, things that we can pull from to give the people comfort in how the decision is made.
Absolutely. And things do change materially year after year.
Yeah.
Big projects come in, big projects leave. So things do change every year. So, okay, additional thoughts on the CIP approach? Okay. Next change, material change.
Next change, and this wasn't too material, but we added an additional category to our fund balance reserve policies. We had previously had assigned and unassigned fund balance, but we also wanted to zero in on our available fund balance, which is the two of those combined. Because while we can assign amounts to projects that we intend to use that money for, it doesn't bind it. It's not any kind of legal or formal action. We're just assigning it there with the intention to use it in the future. So we would like to also look at the available fund balance, and we created a range to keep that within, which our range for this new policy will be between 55 and 65% with a target of 60%. And again, that is just mirroring the range that we've been in for the past at least 5 years. So we typically carry this available fund balance at a good range. So we put that in writing. And that will also affect our credit rating. That keeps us at the AAA credit rating to show that we have these funds available if we need to borrow and pay debt with them or use them for anything else.
Yeah, just to follow on that, available fund balance is something the credit agencies look at, because if push comes to shove and there's a dire emergency, what funds do you have available at your disposal to address those emergencies? And certainly the unassigned is there. The assigned is available for reassignment. And so they say, what are your total resources you have available at your disposal that can be assigned or reassigned or moved around or whatever you need to do to address an emergency? And that's your true, what they call, shock absorber in the system. And while the assigned is assigned for projects that we know about, they like to see that we're looking ahead and starting to set aside funds and earmark funds. To the extent you spend those down, you're reducing your shock absorber in the system, if you will. So it's kind of a balancing act. In the past, we've earmarked monies, and then operating surplus has been able to pay for those, and so then we just earmark it the next year, and it's kind of maintained our position over the last several years. The target range of 55 to 65 is, and I've got a couple of words I may wordsmith here just a little bit before we do this, but it's generally the range that this county was in when we appeared before each of the three credit rating agencies. So any departure from that may raise an eyebrow or two. Not saying we'd lose the AAA, it's just it'd be different than what they saw before. And we know what they saw before, they said, that's fine, that gets you the rating. We don't know where the trigger points are because they look at a lot of different things, not just the reserves. But if you ran the numbers today, and I ran it just on the back of the envelope from what we just talked about for the quarter projection, it looks like we have around 58, 40, 52, 53-ish. If you just take assigned and unassigned for available and nothing committed or restricted, the 53-ish divided by 89 top line revenues, you get right around 60%. So we're pretty much smack dab in the middle of that range right now. And again, that's consistent with what we showed them to get the rating, and so there may be an ability to depart at some level from that, but what that is just a question mark. So we know we're in the safe zone. If we stay there, we know we're in the safe zone, and we'll go from there. Thoughts or questions on available balance?
I'll just also add that I think it was the suggestion by Mr. Vaughters, but in relation to what you just said, we did add the line, this target is an advisement with credit rating agencies to maintain the county's AAA bond rating.
Yeah.
So
and
that's where that came from.
The little bit of wordsmithing I had there is they didn't necessarily advise us. So I'm just going to, this is wordsmithing, but something like the target is consistent with the amounts shown to the agencies when the county attained its AAA rating.
Right.
So it's just as consistent with what we showed them, as opposed to they've advised us that this is,
Yeah,
So,
they didn't
anyway,
directly advise us.
But that's the only subtle change there, if we could wordsmith that.
Yep.
So just to say it's consistent with the amounts in place when we appeared before the agencies and received the AAA.
Well, I wonder if we might want to consider size and scale, referencing size and scale, because I think the general public doesn't understand that a smaller county like Goochland has different targets because of our total budget size relative to Henrico or, Loudoun County. It's not just like one table fits all. It's, and tell me if I'm misspeaking,
No,
but
that's
size makes a big difference in the ratios and the considerations.
That's an excellent point. It's an excellent point that needs to be made. Let's see, the worst case, earthquake, hurricane, whatever you want to call it, natural disaster takes out our high school. It costs $55 million to build a new high school. We have enough reserves to build one school. Fairfax, if they set aside 50% of their $1 billion budget, they could build 100 schools. So as you grow, the nominal dollars you need are maybe not as high as you need now. We need a higher percentage of our budget because the hard dollar amount of any particular item that could affect us is fairly large in relation to our budget.
That's actually the best way to put it, I think. If we added a sentence, that would be a great education element to the language. Just for the person casually reading our financial management policies.
Yeah.
It's not
You
yet.
imply people don't do that.
It's a cure for insomnia. But you're right. I mean, larger as Goochland grows gracefully, you may or may not at some point be able to slide that percentage down a bit because the nominal dollars would grow enough to be sufficient to take care of any one particular item that might come along. Right now, we're the size that one particular item could really upset us quite a bit. So, but that's an excellent point. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Question, Mr. Chair. How do operating expenses link to the fund balances, or do they all?
Correct me if I'm wrong. We have revenues that come in, expenses that go out. We've got a residual, a lot of which be used for CIP maintenance, and then the net balance from that would close out to reserves. So if it's a deficit, it draws on reserves. If it's positive, it would add reserves. So the reserves are our annual operating budget closes out fund balance. And if there's any left over, you add to it if there's not. And one of the things we've done is cover the operating expense of the maintenance CapEx, but also cover any increase that might be necessary on the revenue stabilization fund and the available fund balance to keep those, because they're done as a percentage of the budget, so to keep those in line with any growth. You pay for your maintenance CapEx, you do whatever you need to do to maintain those percentages and close the rest of balance. Now, as a practical matter, what we've done is taken a look and said if the revenue stabilization fund is fully funded, and if our available reserves are in the target range, and we have what we need as far as sufficient reserves go, then sometimes we will visit taking whatever extra is left over at the end of the day and say, can we pull ahead some of the CIP projects? Or can we earmark it for some of those projects that we know might have cost overruns? It's money that you can be allocated toward different things. But first things first, obviously, pay expenses, maintain your capital assets, maintain your reserves, and then you've got whatever left over available to do, maybe pull ahead some projects or earmark. Does that make sense?
It does. So the challenge that the new board will face is, potential requests for significant increases in operating expenses due to increased public safety. So we're adding 2 fire stations. That's a 25% increase from what we have. Being aware of that as we figure out what these ratios need to be is going to be critical as we determine the scope and size of fire rescue and public safety.
Yes, definitely.
The next board is going to face some challenges, but the decisions will be along the lines of, do we add personnel equipment to existing brick and mortar, or when do we take on new brick and mortar? Because that's a whole different game. We have, during the past 12 years, more than tripled the full-time firefighters and built Station 6, all out of cash without raising taxes or raising the reserves. So as the county's revenues grow, it can accommodate an expansion of county services to support that growth. And it needs to just be coordinated, I guess, is where you're going with that, is to coordinate the growth of the county with the delivery of county services, public safety, public education. It all needs to grow together. All those gears are connected.
From an accounting perspective, Neil's questions in mine. I would consider that, a lot of that expansion one-time human capital expenditures. So it's still got capital expenditures in there. We've always, I feel like, and tell me if I'm wrong, I feel like we've lumped it into OpEx. But have we ever treated, do we have the ability, and have we ever treated it as this is really a one-time necessity to get
When
to
you
where
say
we need to?
Human capital, you mean new bodies?
I mean, new bodies.
Because that
yeah.
will be recurring. I mean, it's a
Well, no,
one-time
it'll
major
eventually be
expense.
recurring, but that initial bump, that I think we're seeing that the incremental
Right.
uptick over time can be to our detriment, versus saying we're going to get to where we need to be, that we can justify that that's a one-time human capital increase. I don't know. I mean, I'm asking from an accounting
If there is a
perspective.
recurring source of funds, they can backfill it. So it's one thing if you say, this
Yeah.
year we want to add 20 bodies to the budget, so let's use fund balance because we didn't anticipate that we're going to use fund balance. But next year we have to have a recurring source
Yeah,
of funds
yeah.
that will backfill it and replace our investment from it. So, it does work for that one time, but you got to have that recurring source of
Okay.
funds somewhere.
Yeah. It just doesn't mean it has to be, right, you have planning time. You
Right.
have, the ability to adjust upward.
Yes.
Okay, that's the definition of available resources.
That's right.
Are there other things?
The only other change that we made was changing the wording in relation to the revenue stabilization reserve and when we can draw that down. Our old policy said that the third or fourth quarter forecasted general fund revenues. We're going to change that to actual general fund revenues, excluding use of prior year fund balance. In the old policy, if they declined more than 1.5%, we're going to change that to 3% of revenues collected at the same time period, 1 year to the next. So we're looking at a major decrease in revenue from one period to the next, rather than, our old policy didn't even refer to what the decline was compared to. So decline by 1.5%, declining from what? So we put a little more detail in there of what we're going to use for a reserve. Stabilization reserve, and we also did a little changing to the wording when referring to the real estate assessments. The old policy said our forecast to decrease more than 3%. We're changing that to have decreased more than 3%. So we have realistic numbers now, and if the actual numbers are decreasing 3%, we can borrow from our revenue stabilization reserve.
Yeah, on that point, we actually have in hand the assessments for the coming year before we do the budget. So we don't need a forecast, we know what they're going to be. This is an attempt to define rain. When you say, when can I use the rainy day fund? Well, when it's raining. Well, how do you define rain? The state defines rain as a forecast that's reduced by more than 2%. So if they forecast 10% growth and it drops to 8% growth, they can tap the rainy day fund. That's forecasting rain that may not ever happen. We've decided that it should be raining before you tap the rainy day fund. It's just a different philosophy. Thoughts on that, defining rain when we tap the rainy day fund?
Makes sense.
And it's meant to be there, so if there's a temporary dislocation from a recession or some other thing, we can not have to hire through the cycle, but we can maintain our people and dip in the rainy day and spackle it in very temporary, as opposed to a one-time event of catastrophic loss. Thoughts on the changes to the policy?
Think they help set us up for success going forward?
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Carl.
Mr. Chairman, are we going to report this out from the committee? Is the committee going to accept this, or?
Yes, thank you for that. If there's no other comments on the changes, I'll entertain a motion to recommend to the Board of Supervisors approval of these amendments to the Houston County financial policy.
What about the things we discussed internally? Because I noticed Ms. Kay taking notes. How do
The
we
change to the credit
how do
rating
we
agency reference.
make those references if we, if we're just wordsmithing, like you said earlier?
As amended. Say as amended rather than as presented.
That's fine. Okay, I just want to make sure we.
Give the motion.
I'll let Neil make I'll let Chairman
Parliamentary
Howard
for
make
committee here.
the motion then.
You're Vice Chair all around. Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee approve the Houston County financial policy
Recommend.
as amended. To recommend to the board with supervisors.
As amended. Thank you for that. It's been moved. We have a second. Our parliamentarian has seconded it. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, nay? Any abstentions? Okay, we got about 10 minutes left for our meeting here. Other business, do you have those slides?
I do.
Let me go ahead and try. What I've done over the years is try to introduce 5 minutes of a topic that might be of interest to the group here. But we talked about maintenance capex and depreciation and liquidation of county assets and the need to replace. We've talked about a variety of different subjects. Today's subject for 5 minutes is going to be inflation. Where did it come from? When's it going to go away? And why do we care about inflation? Price of houses, price of cars, price of a loaf of bread, wages we have to pay to attract people. It just pervades our budget. So I thought it was worthy of 2 seconds on inflation. This is from the Federal Reserve Economic Database, the FRED database. It's a public database. It's out in the public domain. This shows the federal government's total surplus or deficit for the last 125 years, give or take. And you see for about 100 years, maybe as many as 200 years, this doesn't go back all the way, the federal government has basically passed a balanced budget. There's a little tiny dip in 1944 for the war. We ran a little deficit because of the war, but then back on track. And then for some reason, the last 20 years from 2020, last 20 years, the federal government has just lost its mind. And we're running multi-trillion-dollar deficits. There's your source of inflation. And that's why for the last 30 years, you haven't really felt inflation 10%. It's been 1 or 2. Well, with a balanced budget, that's pretty much what you get. Now, just think about your own kitchen table issues. When you want to spend more than you take in, there's a couple different ways to do that. One is to dip into savings. We know the federal government's got a $30 trillion debt. They don't have any savings. That's one. The second one is you could issue debt, which is an alternative. And the Fed has a third alternative, which is to print money. And as long as they issue debt to pay for these deficits, the money comes out of the private sector, goes into the public sector, and everything's balanced. The inflation gets triggered when they choose the third option, which is let's print instead of issuing debt. So if you go to the next chart, this is the money supply. And in the Great Recession of 2008, the gray bar, they printed some money to keep the economy from downward spiral, which is fine. Then kept printing for a while and then stabilized for 10 years or so. And then when the pandemic hit in 2020, which is the thin gray bar, they passed some emergency measures and printed, well, if you go from pre-pandemic, which was about 4 trillion, was the outstanding money supply, 2 years later it's 9 trillion. They've more than doubled the money supply by issuing $5 trillion in 2 years. There's your 10% inflation. So they first ran the deficits of multi-trillion and then printed to finance it and monetize it. Now, this year they're running about 1.7 trillion deficit. At 10% inflation, the 30 trillion outstanding gets deflated by 3 trillion. So with 10% inflation, the 30 trillion is really 27 trillion. And then they increase the deficit by 1.7 trillion. They're actually monetizing the debt, getting ahead of the game, even though they're running deficits. They're doing this on purpose. I don't know why. It hurts the most vulnerable. It is a devastating event when people are just barely getting by, have to pay more for bread or a gallon of gas or a gallon of milk, and they just can't make ends meet. This is devastating to those folks. Folks at the higher end, doesn't matter. They just tell their people to cut bigger checks. But the people that are most vulnerable, the ones that are just really hurt by this. Now, that's the last 20 years has nothing to do with politics. We never bring politics into this building. There's plenty to go around. This is really economics and how it affects Gleason County, the price of our houses, the price of our cars. When's inflation going to come back down? You can see at 10% inflation, there was a movement to just throw all the bumps out. So you saw it started to actually shred money now. For the last 12 months last year, they printed 120 billion a month. They printed 120 billion a month. Every month you see that climb. Well, now they're shredding about 80 billion a month to try and bring inflation back down a little bit. Because once it got over 10%, a lot of folks get pretty upset. So,
Just for the public's benefit, slide 2 and slide 3. Slide 2 is a year-over-year kind of income statement view versus this, which is a balance sheet, static in time view. I just want to make sure the public doesn't view this chart as year-over-year like the previous chart.
correct. You're exactly right. The previous chart was what I'll call a flow,
Yep.
and this is a stock.
Yeah.
So this is the outstanding stock, the outstanding balance. Now, advanced finance, and the Fed prints 5 trillion, gives it to the banks. The banks don't put the 5 trillion in the bottom drawer, do they? They take 4 of the 5 out and then lend it back out, right? They have to keep 10% reserves, right? So 10% leverage, you print 5 trillion, they're putting 50 trillion in the economy. We have a fractional banking system. They only keep a fraction of deposits on hand and then lend the rest out. So the money multiplier is 10 times this. And so people run around scratching, where did it come from? That's where it came from. I don't have a solution, but we have to take this into account as we manage the county's finances and look at the inflationary impacts of wages, prices, tax revenues. It all does impact us in a big way. So that's why I want to spend just 5 minutes on where it came from, where it's headed, and unfortunately the trends in that previous chart, the trends are not good. If you go back to that previous chart, if you just drew a regression line, the trends are not good. This is lower lows and lower highs every time you go down that zigzag. And I don't know where it ends, I really don't. But all we can do is we're corks bobbing on the surface of the water here. And this is the water that's moving us around, but it's at least nice to know what's going on, at least have some view. So that was my 5 minutes. Any questions or thoughts on it?
Great.
By the way, Goodson still has that flat balanced budget line going. We last 20 years we haven't lost our minds. All right, that's it I had for other business. If there's no more commentary on that, public comment is the next item on the agenda. We've got about 2 minutes. We'd like to fill up these 2 minutes. You don't have to use the entire 2. You can.
Everybody's looking at me. Just a couple of things. Michael used a couple of acronyms, OPED. I live in a world of acronyms, and that's a new one to me. I don't know what an OPED is.
Okay.
I can tell you that's other post-employment benefits.
All right. I have
So
read.
the main driver is health insurance.
Got it. Okay. And also I heard an MD&A.
That is a management discussion and analysis.
Oh, there you go. Okay.
So it's just us elaborating on why certain things increased or decreased. It's giving
I won't throw out
words.
SL6 or anything into my acronym. The other, in reading through, and Mr. Waters' comment about the casual reading, I did wade through this. Withdrawal and drawdown were sometimes used interchangeably, and because we have some detail in here, I wanted to make sure withdrawal was the same as a drawdown.
In what context?
Well,
Fund balance is.
You talking about fund balance?
yeah, it says we're going to have withdrawal or a drawdown, which I simplified as they're synonyms.
Yeah, I mean, whether you
And I'm thinking back to that casual reader is going to, I had to stop and
could
just
say we're
confirm
tapping
this.
reserve.
Say it again?
There's a
Okay.
variety of different ways you could describe it, but it's just accessing or use of reserves, use of fund balance.
And I was looking if there's an opportunity to make it uniform. So people would say, all right, what's the difference between a withdrawal and a drawdown?
Okay.
It just personal experience, making sure I confirm that the two were the same.
Okay. Yeah, you're on solid ground. That it?
Yeah.
That was easy.
Well, you said don't use it all.
Well, And a lot of these policies are, counties mirror each other. We don't want to recreate the wheel with everything. So I would guess we didn't necessarily decide those two synonyms. I think, it's like GAAP. It's
Right.
the generally accepted principles on how we do it. So I would think to the public, we can only wordsmith so much.
We are, other citizen, any comments from the other citizen?
Thank you all for making these wonderful changes that were not here 12 years ago. And for putting the county on the straight and narrow financially. Thank you.
I'll grant you a little extra time if you'd like to continue that thought. Thank you for being here and thank you for paying attention. We do a better job when people are watching, so good. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, I move that we adjourn to 12:30 p.m. on February 6, 2024.
So
Sorry,
more discussion first?
If it's okay. Yeah. I think I'd be remiss if I didn't take a moment to thank you for your leadership in this. I don't know how many years before the 4 that I joined you've been doing this, but you've done it the whole time that I've been here. So, I think I do believe that people are appointed at a certain time for a certain thing, and what you've done for this county from a financial perspective, the county can never repay it or forget. So, thank you.
Well, thank you for those comments. I appreciate that. If you go on any longer, I'm going to get embarrassed and misty. I didn't say stop. I just said I didn't go on any longer. Thank you for that, Mr. Chair. I appreciate it. Right back at you for your service. We have a motion.
I apologize for my premature motion. Very thoughtful, Mr. Smith.
Second. Moved that we adjourn to the 12:30 February 6, 2024 meeting, at which time there'll be a reorganization and appointment of new leadership. Do we have a second for that?
Second.
It's been seconded. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay.